So I've got games for you, and I think I've selected some games that are both informative but also entertaining. So d4, d5, all normal. c4, Queen's Gambit. e6, Queen's Gambit decline. And all this, I would say, is relatively normal. So white is developing, black is developing, bishop to g5. This was for many, many, many years considered the main move. Now, because I play this for black, almost everyone that I play against takes here on d5, the exchange variation. And, you know, people play that position. But back in the day, bishop to g5 was pretty much standard. Knight to d7, I mean, they're just developing. Okay, so in this particular opening, what is the problem piece for black? And this is actually pretty common in most openings. So exactly, the light squared bishop, as many of you are saying in the chat. So the light squared bishop on c8, that can often be a struggle to get into the game. So sometimes black will try to play pawn to e5 at the right moment to free the diagonal for the bishop. And then sometimes black will sort of go a slower route and try to bring it to the queen side and advance. But you can see that in general, the problem is that the pawns obstruct the bishop. So we're going to see that sort of struggle, sort of. So a3, rook to e8, queen to c2. White is playing a waiting game because what black wants to do, the moment that white moves the bishop, black is going to capture, make the bishop move again, and then, so let's say I go here. Totally logical move. Black captures, white captures, and then what black will often do is either play the move knight to d5 to try to trade some pieces off, or play the move b5, gaining tempo and trying to get the bishop in the diagonal. Okay. So that's why white is playing this sort of waiting game with queen to c2. All right, pawn to a6, pawn to h3. Again, more waiting game. Black plays the move b5 and says, okay, I'm challenging your pawn here, do something. Pawn takes, and then bishop to d3. So here's what Checkover was thinking, although I don't know if he was completely right about his decision. He's saying, I finally moved my bishop. All of your pawns are on the white squares, which block this bishop from getting into the game very easily. Having said that, what has black gained in return during this waiting period that white sort of had, where white was playing little pawn moves to wait to bring the bishop out? In the meantime, black has gained somewhat. So black has gained some space for what for what white has done, with the little waiting moves. So I think, even though I get Checkover's point that the bishop's still sort of bad, because of black's space, what black may be able to do is advance and get the bishop off and bishop out and trade it off. Okay, so we'll see how the game develops. But bishop to b7, white castled. Black gets to the c-file, the queen tucks away, keeping the battery, but getting off of the open file. That makes a lot of sense. Pawn to h6, the bishop retreats, doesn't want to trade for the knight. All of this is pretty, I would say, standard. I think you're going to be surprised when white hits black with a very tactical move, and out of nowhere, white gets a big attack. But we'll get there in just a minute. Knight to b6, I actually like this move a lot. This c4 square, anytime two pawns clamp down on a square, that's a strong square. So black is thinking, okay, I'll plop my knight in there. I'll just sort of probe your queen side and see what you're going to do about it. If you have to play the move pawn to b3 to keep me out of there, then you weaken your control of the c-file because your knight wouldn't have the protection of the pawn anymore. So the looming threat of knight to c4 is an annoying thing for white to deal with. White doesn't want to play b3. I mean, other than it hangs a pawn. But even if it didn't hang a pawn, the thing is that b3 weakens control of the c-file. So queen to a2, knight comes into c4. Again, there's no b3 here because that would leave the a-pawn insufficiently protected. So white plays the move a4, which I like. because white is challenging this queenside construct over here, and he's not going to make it so easy for black to just stabilize the knight here on c4. And after a4, he may look to play the move b3 and kick the knight out of there. And with the pawn off of the a3 square, the pawn isn't hanging there anymore. Okay, so pawn to b4, I think that makes sense. Knight to b1, the idea is to challenge the knight on c4 now that it doesn't have the protection of the pawns. Queen to b6, I think this is all pretty normal. Knight to d2, challenging black's best piece. There's still a struggle for black, which is to get rid of the bishop. So here, black played the move knight a5, which isn't bad, but what would have been a much simpler plan for black to equalize the game here? Exactly, Nightmare, exactly. Take on d2, play a5, as many were suggesting, and then bishop to a6, trading off the bad bishop. For a very nice bishop, by the way. Black wouldn't lose anything. Black would still have the control of the open file. Black's just getting rid of the bishop that's biting on granite there. That's all. So that's what I would have done. It's a much simpler plan than knight a5. Knight a5 is very ambitious, but number one is, after knight to e5, black still hasn't sort of solved those like opening problems that he needs to solve because he still has this bishop here. So I think black's playing with fire a little bit, but black's still doing okay. b3, queen comes back to b1, but the c4 square, which was a very powerful square for black, is now controlled very heavily by white's pieces. So one has to ask, like, what's my knight doing over here on a5 these days, right? Queen b4 was played, knight to f3, and now knight back to c4. But, here's the thing. White had a very cool tactical idea here, which is pretty deep. So you may see it, right? And then you have to talk yourself into it. So it's white to play, and here's what white was thinking. Black's pieces are starting to infiltrate and saturate the queen side, but what that means for black is that black has left the king side a little bare of defenders. White, who has two bishops pointing in that direction, along with the queen, two knights over on the king side, white can start to think about some possible action against the king because black's pieces are heavily guarding the queen side but not protecting the king. So I see some of you are suggesting knight takes f7, bringing the king out, and then playing bishop to g6. Okay. Now there's sort of an old saying in chess, which is that if you see a tactical possibility, but it doesn't exactly work as well as you'd like for it to work, try to reverse the move order. And I see that Mushroom had mentioned the move bishop to g6, which is a very strong move, and this is exactly what Checover played. And this is the beginning of what I wanted to show you in this game, which is why I sort of rushed through the beginning part of the game. This is really the moment I wanted to start, because bishop to g6 is not a normal move. That's not something you'll see all the time. But the idea is that if after the move bishop to g6, I am attacking your f-pawn. And the thing is, if you capture my bishop, I swing in with the queen, and again, black is a little bit, bare of defense on the king side because, all the pieces are over here. It's not that easy for black to get back. Now, what is white threatening here? White is threatening bishop captures pawn because of the pin, and that would also load up on the g-pawn, right? There's ideas of queen into f7 because the knight supports. So there's all sorts of nasty ideas coming black's way, and once we grab this pawn, the knight can come into g5 too. So white is just pouncing on black's king here. So after the move bishop to g6, black was like, wait a minute, let me hold it down and play rook to f8. If you want to give me the knight and bishop for a rook and pawn, by all means, I want to get rid of these attackers. Well, white said, okay, I'm going to play bishop takes f7. But after rook takes, I'm not going to take your rook. What does white do here to pursue the attack? Exactly. Queen to g6. Everyone's got it right. Everyone's got it right. Another beautiful move. Who would have ever thought the queen on b1 would now start to attack the black king? The queen on b1, right? That's the thing about chess, right? It's like only 64 squares, but the geometry is crazy, right? Queen on b1, in one move, due to a bishop sacrifice, springs into the attack on the king, while these pieces are just stuck over here. So, okay, now there's a direct threat on the rook, and there's still the bishop takes h6 idea. So, for example, if you guard the rook by retreating, after bishop takes h6, black is nearly dead. Because there's a checkmate threat here, there's knight coming in to the g5 square, there's an attack on e6 if this knight on f6 moves. White's just trouncing black here. So, you know, black played a very practical move here, rook c to f8. He said, you know, take this rook, at least I lift my rook up and guard my king a little bit. So that's what happened. Knight takes rook, rook takes, and now you're not going to believe this. This is another brutal approach by this is an example of throwing the kitchen sink at your opponent. Very good, guys. Rook takes c4. Awesome, 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 awesome. So rook takes c4. This is brutal. This is throwing the sink, throwing the kitchen sink at him. The idea of rook takes c4 is to allow the knight into e5, sacrificing more material, but to bring in the necessary pieces to assault the king. So pawn takes. Now, if the queen takes, that's not good. Because now when I hit you with knight e5, I'm attacking your queen and I'm attacking the rook. So it made a lot of sense to take with the pawn and open up the bishop and not put the queen in harm's way. Knight e5, attacking the rook. You can't guard the rook, so you have to move the rook. There's no way to guard the rook. The king is guarding it, but that's not enough. So you have to move the rook. And now, bishop takes h6, which some of you were mentioning just a moment ago, is even stronger because now it comes with an actual threat, which is checkmate. So white is crunching black here after a flurry of sacrifices. But it's not over. Knight e8. Knight e8. So keeps the game alive. Stops checkmate. There was no other way to stop checkmate. So knight e8 keeps the game alive. Right? You know, it ain't over till it's over. That's the key. Okay? So queen takes e6 check. King h8. Now, probably king h7 makes more sense because you don't allow these knight jumps with check. So I think Zagoryansky, if he wanted to try to survive this, he had to go king h7. And the reason is, you know, sometimes a move matters, like a single move matters. He went to h8, and I think all that does is it invites these knight checks at the opportune moment, whereas if you go king h7, maybe white just has to draw this game here by perpetual check. Because I don't think white can afford to give away another piece. And black has the defense of queen to d6 offering to trade queens. You know, and when you've sacrificed material, you don't want to trade queens. You still have to go for the attack. But he played instead, after this check, he played king to h8. Which I think is not a good one. And here, Checkover played bishop to f4, which is sort of surprising because knight to g6, king h7, knight takes, and then queen to d6, I think this is what he was hoping for. And he says, okay, at least after this exchange of pieces, I have this opportunity to create counterplay here. I'm still attacking your bishop, and I'm not getting checkmated, right? So that was the reason that in this position, Checkover played bishop to f4. So at the present moment, white is down a piece, but has collected plenty of pawns and continues to pursue an assault on the black king because the queens aren't coming off, so the attack is still very real. Bishop to f6, knight f7 check. He gave back the material, but now the game is pretty much just over because now it's 2 pieces for a rook, but the problem is black's king is very weak and white has a lot of pawns. So white played very well here, rook to c1, just to get the rook in on the attack. Queen to e7. Checkover's like, yeah, you want to trade? I'm going to collect more pawns. I'm eliminating any possible pawn breakthroughs you're not going to get through here. And you have 2 pieces for the rook, but I've got 800 extra pawns. So the game didn't last long after this. And the pawns start to advance, and the rook comes to the 7th, and then his opponent is like, screw this, I give up. Because the pawns are coming down, the bishop is under attack, these things are just coming down the board, he just resigned. So here we go. So here's another one. Now this game, you guys know what a sham sacrifice is? You guys know what it is, but maybe you never heard it referred to as a sham sacrifice. But sham sacrifice, like a lot of sham sacrifices happen in this game. It's where you move a piece to a square where it looks like it can be captured, but you can't really capture it due to these like underlying reasons, like these other reasons. So let's get to the good stuff here, but there are plenty of them in this game. Okay, so here we go. So we have an English opening here, and it was a King's Indian setup by Koblenz. And Checkover is playing a very interesting setup in the English where he's going to place his pawns on d3 instead of d4, and he's attacking with the move f4. The nice thing about this setup for white is it sort of reverses the role on the King's Indian player. If black is playing the King's Indian defense, black's probably a dynamic and relatively aggressive player. So reversing the roles and hitting them first with a pawn break on the f-file, that makes the King's Indian player uncomfortable. So bishop to e6, pawn to d3, queen to d7. It all seems very logical, just lining up the pieces. Pawn to e4, knight to a6, all developing moves. We're not at the good part yet. Rook to b1. White is looking to expand on the queen side possibly. Rook to b8, pawn to b3, b5, and then finally, after the move b5, white noticed a possible move. So, okay, f5. This is where the tactics, almost every move from now until the end is a tactical move. So f5 is a move that, of course, white wants to play, damaging and crashing into black's king side, but black was sort of thinking, I'm stopping that because I've got 3 pieces on that. But after the move b5, something changed about the position, which allowed white the opportunity to go f5. So what changed after the move b5? It's sort of funny how like one move over here changes what you may be able to do over here. But you know, chess is played as a complete game. So what happens on the queen side, what happens on the king side, what happens in the center, it all goes hand in hand one way or another. Exactly. Egon, you got it. c6 is unprotected. So c6 is only protected by the queen. It used to be blunted by the pawn. So f5. And g takes f5 happened. That's the logical move. Otherwise, the bishop is trapped. So g takes f5, e takes f5. Again, if you don't capture on f5, your bishop is trapped. So bishop takes f5, and the idea of this thing was bishop takes c6 with the overloaded queen. So bishop takes c6 is, I mean, technically if you take that, it's just a trade of pawns, but you know, you won the c-pawn, you know, white won the c-pawn and black won, you know, one of the kingside pawns. But the thing about this for black is white's getting the activity against the king. So black didn't want that. Koblenz played queen to c8. So queen c8 keeps the guard of the bishop. So white's like, well, you still can take this, but then I can take that. So I'll leave this bishop on c6 for the moment, and I'll play bishop to g5, just loading up on the king side. b4 was played by Koblenz, attacking the knight. We have the intermediate move, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and here's another. I love these in-between moves because, like, okay, I'm attacking the knight, so your first instinct sort of like, okay, I'm going to move the knight. But white didn't move the knight. What did white play? Everyone has so much built-up anger inside of them. They're like, I'm like, don't go crazy, play a move, and then all of you played the most aggressive move possible. You guys really need to, to take it out on somebody. Bishop to e4, very good dimple pinch in Asia. Very good. So the reason I like this move is because you want to pry open the f-file. And in order to do that, you got to get rid of this bishop. So I'm attacking the bishop, and if you capture me, right, then I get my pieces back into the game. So bishop takes, and another sacrifice, a fake sacrifice, because it's not really a sacrifice. The sham sacrifice is not really a sacrifice because there's these underlying reasons why it's not good to take the piece. So we've already seen a few of them. But now it's pawn takes. So leaving this knight hanging, but since the f-file is open now, there is an attack on the bishop on f6. So the bishop retreated to d8, which appears that it's leaving the king side, like leaving the king stranded a little bit, but the idea is for the bishop to come to a more, like a stronger diagonal. So knight to d5 was played, which makes a lot of sense. The knight is beautifully placed here in the center, and so that move makes a lot of sense. Okay, queen to g4 happened, and now white plays another sham sacrifice. What is it? Everyone is so darn aggressive, it's unbelievable. Everyone wants to play rook f6. It's crazy. Knight on 2 to c3. Now this is a really nice move because what it does is it sets up, first of all, there's a discovered attack on the queen. And the idea of playing knight to c3 is to, if they trade, to capture back with the knight, and then the knight is heading for the beautiful f5 square. And that would just be positional domination. If white gets all these knights and rooks against this king, that's going to be terrible for the black forces, right? If I can get this, ooh, that's going to be rough. That's going to be rough. So Koblenz realized that, so he goes back with the queen. Knight to b5 was played by Checkover, so now he's throwing his pieces into the mix. Bishop to b6 check, takes, and now rook to f5. I love the move rook to f5 because what white is doing is stopping the move f5. That's the key. White is camping out on the light squares, and black is basically can't do anything, and black's just sitting there with a weak king. But the sham sacrifices are not over. So knight c5 happened. Queen to d5. Look at this light square dominated. This is just beautiful. White's posting up on all the light squares. Black can't do anything. White's going to bring the rooks over, bearing down over here. It's just crazy. a6 is played. Okay, sham sacrifice. Go for it. White to play another sham sacrifice. Go for it. Knight to d4. Yep. Knight to d4. The idea is if you take this knight, now you've opened up the queen's protection of the rook. Okay, knight to d4. Knight back to e6. White traded. Black cannot take with the pawn here, by the way, because if rook takes rook, black loses this rook due to a series of checks. A check on a8, and if the king comes up to any square on the 7th rank, we fork. If the queen comes back and blocks, we hit him with the rook. Now the king has to come up, but then we check and we win the rook, for example. So, yeah. So he took with the queen, and there's a rule in chess, which is that when you're attacking, you don't trade pieces. You don't trade your major pieces, that's for sure, because you have good piece activity, he has the weaker king, keep the pieces on the board. So queen to d2 just makes a lot of sense. f6, queen h6. All right, guys, sham sacrifice. Last sham sacrifice, and then black resigned. Yep. Rook to g5. Cruncher. Just an absolute cruncher. If you move, if you capture, you lose the queen. That's the idea. And obviously, if you go to the corner, you know, then I take your rook. And if you come up this way, that spells trouble. Hi, I'm Peter Giannatos, founder of the Charlotte Chess Center. If you enjoyed these videos, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to watch these videos live, be sure to follow us on Twitch.